Hi, Tracee. Welcome to the show. How are you?
I'm good. It's great to see you, Lisa. Thank
Yes,
you.
I'm super excited to talk about the project you just wrapped up. I think we alluded to it probably when you were on the show previously, and now you're done. Congratulations.
Thank you.
So I wanted to just talk through how that went for you and share any tips that you have, and also myself here about all the details because we've talked, but I feel like we haven't gotten into some of the nitty-gritty details. So why don't we start by telling people what project we're talking about? So what did you just complete?
Yeah, so I have been working on trying the 14 highest peaks in the world above 8,000 meters, and I have been trying to climb them for like the last 9 years. In October, I finished the last one for me, which was Shisha Pangma, which was really exciting. I became the first US woman to complete this project, which was unexpected, but also really exciting. And so I've been climbing a lot of mountains this last few years. I'm good to be home for a little while.
Totally.
And I've been at the last 2 years, I tried to climb like 8,000 meter peaks each year the last 2 years. So there was just a lot of time intense and travel. And I am really, my house has been neglected and it feels really good to just be, honestly, to be home and kind of fixing up things in my house and being a little bit of a homebody. I'm sure at some point I will get really bored, but I'm not there yet.
I'm sure you will. I think it's healthy too to have that contrast and let yourself get bored for a while and then just see what feels right for you as a next step.
Totally.
9 years. I'm curious about the genesis of this idea for you. So, at what point were you like, maybe I should try to climb all 14?
That's a really good question. And it definitely morphed over time. But I think the first time I really gave it any thought was after I summited Annapurna in 2021. And it was a funny thing to think about then because Annapurna was probably one of my most challenging climbs. We can go into that more, but I was, literally questioning whether I belonged there. I had a really hard summit experience. But then, like, when I started reflecting upon it, it's funny how the mind kind of changes things. Then I thought, Annapurna, I think, is sort of the crux. It's one of the most dangerous of the 14 peaks. It's unpredictable. And so I think there was a part of my brain that thought, you got that one done. Like, you can probably do the other ones. There's some other hard ones out there. So it was funny because that was in 2021. And at that point, I'd been on 8 expeditions to 8,000 meter peaks, but I'd only summited 4. So I was a
Okay.
long ways away from the goal. When I look back, I think it's funny that I thought, oh, maybe this is something I can do after just having finished 4.
But there must have been something inside of you that knew it was possible. I really think that when we have huge, audacious goals like that, there's some small part of us that believes we can do it.
Totally. I mean, I thought, at the time, I just really thought, I didn't think that I would be, back then, people weren't climbing multiple peaks in a year.
Now it's in vogue to go to Nepal and 5 of them.
Yep. So back then, people weren't really doing that at all. And so I did believe I could do it. I think I thought a little bit it was, I'd probably do one, or maybe if I had a really good year, 2 in a year. And, I'm 50 now. The only part of me that worried was like, am I gonna, if I'm doing one a year, is my body gonna, be able to keep doing them. I've been surrounded by climbers in their 60s and even older that are still doing
Mhm.
these peaks. And a lot of times they're stronger than me. So I did believe I could do it. I thought it would take a lot longer than it ended up taking.
And so I'm interested about the logistics. And you mentioned travel and spending a lot of time in tents. Did you at some point sit down and map it out? Like, okay, this is how it could work? Or did you just sort of go with the flow and pick the next one that seemed
Yeah, I went with the flow, I would say.
okay?
Totally. I mean, until the last 2 years when I was trying to get a lot of them done, I really was like picking my next expedition based on like where I had friends that were going to climb. I
Mhm.
wanted to climb with people I knew. At that time, it wasn't like like now, almost every season, every 14,000 or 8,000 meter peak is getting climbed. Back
Mhm.
then, like there'd be years when no one was climbing Kachinjunga, no commercial expeditions to Annapurna. So you kind of I could have in theory mapped it out, but like you are reliant upon what companies were doing and where people are going, because I wasn't ever at a point where I was going to like approach one company and say like, this is my project and let's map it out. Like
Right.
I was more going with what they were doing each year and like that.
And it just all fit together perfectly too.
It all fit together perfectly. I would say fortunate in a lot of ways.
Would you say Annapurna was the hardest of the 14?
For me, it was. For me, it was definitely the hardest. I don't think it is the hardest mountain. So I think that like personally, it was the hardest for me because at that point, like I said, I'd only summited 4. So I really didn't have that much experience. I'd never had like a 20+ hour summit day. So I really didn't know that my body could do that. Like to me, that was mind blowing because I'd done Toyu, Everest, Makalu, which are all much shorter summit days. So for me, it was really hard. We ran out of oxygen too. And I had a couple of problems on Annapurna. My asthma inhaler had fallen in a crevasse. Like I didn't have extra contacts. So I had a little bag. This was maybe a good example or what not to do. I had a bag of all the things I really needed, including because I wear daily contacts, my asthma inhalers, just my normal like medications. And for some reason, when I was packing up my stuff the morning when we were leaving Camp 3, I just handed that little bag to Pasong, the Sherpa I was climbing with, which was stupid because it didn't weigh anything and it belonged in my bag. And he had stuffed it in the top of his bag. And then when they decided there was like a big ice wall that was hard to get up, the Sherpas decided to pull the bags up, not on their backpacks. And when he was pulling his bag up, my little like ditty bag of stuff like wasn't secured and it like popped out and rolled into a crevasse. There was no way to get it back. So for me, it was mentally like, oh my gosh, I'm wearing contacts that are not designed to be worn for days. I don't have my asthma inhalers. And then we did run out of oxygen on the way down. Like I didn't have my water bottles froze. Like I kind of didn't have my system dialed. I ran out of food. So that was the hardest one. But I don't think it's the hardest peak.
So many things to dig into there. So when you see your bag of meds and contacts, which you need for vision, right? You need to be safe and you need to be healthy because your inhaler was in there. I imagine your immediate reaction was like, what am I going to do? But then you have to regroup, right? Like, how did you get through that? How did mentally and physically, how did you move past that?
Yeah, initially I was like, I think my climb's over. Like, I don't think it's safe to keep climbing. Like, I have a pair of glasses, but the glasses weren't tinted at all. And the UV radiation up there, like, right, you can't wear glasses. Yeah. That's not enough unless they're like sunglasses, which I didn't have prescription ones. So at first I was like, I think I'm done, which was really disappointing because one of the more challenging parts of Annapurna is between Camp 2 and Camp 3. So it was like, oh my God, like we just got through the hardest part. Like we'd almost gotten hit by an avalanche. Like Pasong had gotten hit by a rock. Like, it was really disappointing. And then I think what got me through it was just thinking, well, you know what? Like, let's just see. Like, let's see how you can do. Like, go up to Camp 4. Like, you don't need to go down right now. Like, nobody's going down. So go to Camp 4 and like see how your breathing's doing. Like, maybe like my asthma's not horrible and it's worse if it's a really cold day. So then I just kept saying, well, let's see if it's a cold day. Like, let's see how you wake up in the morning. Like, and so just breaking it down and just into smaller steps, I think is how I managed it.
And I think I love the idea of like, let's just try. Let's just like know what my boundaries are, but keep going forward and just see how it goes.
Yeah.
Annapurna was for you the toughest. What was the most meaningful of the 14 for you?
I'm not sure to answer that. Probably Shisha Pangma was in a lot of ways the most meaningful. That was the hardest emotionally, but I think it was also the most Yeah, Shisha Pangma was definitely the most meaningful.
Because it was the last one or because of what had happened previously or what made it so meaningful?
Yeah, all of the above. So, the year before I was there in 2023 and tragically 4 people were killed in an avalanche, one of whom was my friend Gina. She and the Sherpa Lama she was climbing with were killed in an avalanche. And then another woman, Anna, and Mingmar, the Sherpa she was climbing with, were killed in a separate avalanche. And that was just, after that happened, just had to think for me, just thinking about the Sherpas working on the mountain and losing their lives for our objectives was really upsetting to me, as well as losing my friend Gina. So I really had to take a step back and think about whether I wanted to finish this project, whether by doing it, I was engaging in a belief system that really wasn't in harmony with how I really
Yeah.
want to move through the world. So that was hard. And then I'll say, and I ultimately did decide to go back there. Then I got to summit finish my 14th peak with a whole group of us, that it was our 14th peak. So the owner of the company that I have climbed like the last 8 mountains with, maybe even 9, is Mingma Ji from Imagine Nepal. And amazingly, even though he's done so many things, he had never been to the true summit of Shisha Pangma. So it was really meaningful for him to do that, and to be able to share that with him was really cool. There was another guy on our team, Sherpas from Pakistan. He became the first Pakistani to summit all 14 peaks, and his story is just amazing. He had started as a cook's helper and worked his way up to like being a cook and then like a guide. And so I've been on many expeditions with him. So to share in like that was amazing. And then there was another Naoki from Japan who I'd climbed a bunch with. That was his 14th peak. He became the first person from Japan to summit all 14. And then Dawa Gelji, who I call Daddy, he had been on Shisha Pangma many times, but he needed that for his 14th peak too. So it was just amazing to be with the Imagine Nepal team and to go back to a place of tragedy and then have something positive come from it.
Yeah. Totally. Because I think we've all wrestled with this as climbers. How did you eventually resolve that internal conflict between seeing Sherpa lose their lives and feeling like that was maybe done in pursuit of our personal goals? How did you eventually come to terms with that? And it's something we all have to do.
Right.
I'm just curious for you how that process was.
I think, for me, I am not going to comment on what was done right or wrong on that day, but I personally really try to always let the Sherpas make the decision about whether it's safe to climb or when we need to turn back. And I've never, it's always been the opposite, honestly, that I think it's too dangerous and I want to go down when the Sherpas still think it's safe. So I think it, to some extent, I thought, you know what, like I am going to keep climbing in a manner where if somebody says that they don't think it's safe, that I honor that and I don't push them at all to continue climbing. And so that was really how I reconciled it.
And that's really like the ethos of teamwork, which is how I think you and I view the partnership between Western climbers and our Sherpa counterparts. And not everybody sees it that way. I'm sure you more than me have seen examples where there's this inequity between climbers and the Western climber is making decisions or pushing too far. And I just think that's a very unfair situation to perpetuate because I couldn't climb without them. And I view them all as friends and counterparts who have more experience than me.
Yeah.
Who I need to be safe. And I hope that starts to change more. I hope more and more people see it that way and share the respect for that community of incredibly strong people who we rely on.
I couldn't agree more. And it's like the Sherpas know the mountain better than anyone.
Anybody.
So, right? Like if they say it's not safe, like I would just never have the audacity to question that. And yeah, it was interesting this year. Had an issue on when we went back. It took 2 tries on Gasherbrum 1 G1. When we went back the second time, like the Sherpas, they were tired, right? They weren't sure if they wanted to give it another try. And that was really hard for me because I was like, well, if you don't want to, like, then we need to just be done. There was some politics and things I wasn't completely understanding that were happening at base camp. And once we started climbing and we got in the ice fall, it had melted out a ton. And I was really scared that it had melted out too much and it wasn't safe. And I remember just stopping and saying, like, you guys, like, I don't need this summit. Like, I'm absolutely okay with going home. Like, if you want to turn around, like, we should turn around. And Kilu said to me, like, no, you know what? Like, I want to go to this summit. And I think that we can do this safely. So for me, I'm not going to push people to, any climbing
100%.
partner to do something they don't think is safe.
Thank you for climbing that way.
Yes, of course.
Okay, so which of the 14 do you like, no way, I would never go back there, done with that mountain?
I'll never go back to Nanga Parbat, and I probably never go back to Annapurna. And I say this, and I think I would never climb Broad Peak again. And I kind of put those 3 in that basket because I think they have objective hazards that you really can't mitigate. Nanga Parbat, there's that's a part of Pakistan that has political instability. And I just don't think it's a super safe region to be traveling in right now. It's sad because it's honestly one of the most breathtaking base camps, and it's a beautiful mountain, but I think, until things change in that region of the country, I wouldn't feel safe going back there. Annapurna, it is objectively just a really incredibly dangerous mountain. Like that, I referred to like the fact that an avalanche almost took us out. There's just rockfall that you can't mitigate. And so honestly, I'm not even sure if I really understood the seriousness of Annapurna that I would do it at this point. But at that point in my climbing career, I didn't quite understand what I was getting into. And then I'm going to put Broad Peak in that bucket too, just because, I mean, I would go back to that base camp and I maybe would climb it again. But I think that there's a lot of rockfall on that mountain that you just.
I haven't been there, but I've heard and seen it, like seen people come down with just huge gashes in their legs from being hit by rock.
Yeah, when we were descending, I really thought that already. And then when we were descending this year, the day after we descended, Murad was killed, a porter from Pakistan, hit by a rockfall wearing a helmet. And, that just for me was tragic and completely cemented in my mind that like that mountain has parts that are really dangerous.
Yeah, I always think that mountains allow us to climb them. Like you and I have talked about this, the notion of conquering, I just think is absurd when it comes to any part of nature. And I think that it's important to be in sync with the mountain and listen, which I find a lot of the Sherpa do as well, and to respect the mountain. And if it doesn't feel safe, then you don't go. You have to listen.
Totally. I agree. Yeah, we feel the same that way.
Well, so much of climbing is mental. And I'm curious, the case of this 9-year project, how did you stay just focused over the course of 9 years with like competing priorities and, things getting canceled and COVID was in the middle of that? And like, how did you just stay focused on this goal?
I think part of it is that climbing really rejuvenates me. And so, to be quite honest, like when I was working as a doctor during COVID, and just, I mean, honestly, climbing gives me, that's how I want to spend my time off. That is climbing. It refreshes my soul. So, and it didn't feel like a project, maybe in the sense that it became in the last 2 years until the last 2 years. It was more like, hey, I'm going to do a really fun trip once or twice a year where I'm going to get to climb. So that part didn't feel hard. Like I will say this last year, when the second year of trying 5 in a row, it became mentally exhausting. And I started to really question it. Like I had to miss out on a family reunion that was really important to me. I was starting to miss out on things that were really important to me. And I was really questioning whether I keep doing it. I think if I didn't finish them this year, I would have found the fortitude to keep doing it another year because that's kind of my personality. But I would say in the beginning, it was really fun. And then in the end, I don't know, I guess things that kept me going was friends and family, like being on those climbs, like having a satellite texting device and just being able to text with friends and get support and hear what was going on back home for me was huge. I know like some climbers that are older than us, like think that you should just be like totally on the mountain and like not communicating with home. But I think the ability to stay in touch with my friends and family made it, not so daunting. And, I didn't ever bring a sat phone. I just sort of set a boundary, not a boundary, but, that was the way I was going to communicate was with the satellite texting device. So it didn't feel like it interfered with the climb to me at all.
It's interesting too. And as I coach people who are maybe going on their first expedition, one of the things we talk about is connectivity. There's two schools of thought. One is I want to stay connected because in my case, it helps me feel like I have a life off the mountain. It sort of balances things out. But there have also been times when I was like communicating a friend and they're talking about, going to happy hour or like going to the beach. And I'm like sitting on the side of a frozen mountain, unable to breathe. And I get jealous of that. And it sort of takes my head out of the game, out of the mountain game. I think, conflicting ideas about staying connected. I think what I found was that it had to be with someone who understood what I was doing and understood the seriousness and could offer support as opposed to just kind of chit chat about what was going on in their lives, because that kind of unrelated chit chat is what took me out of the game. And I wanted to stay focused on what I needed to do to climb.
That's super interesting. And that makes a ton of sense to me. And now that you say it, I think about, I mean, over time, right? Like it evolved. Like I learned which people I could communicate with that understood, because you understood. I would be texting you, my friend Ellen Miller, who's climbed a bunch,
Right.
the peaks, people like that. My family, they understood. But I agree. Like if I was just getting like an update on like happy hour or the beach, like that wouldn't have felt helpful. And it's funny, I had, kind of the people that I text when I was on the mountains aren't always the people who I see or spend the most time with in real life, which is interesting. Like one thing that was really interesting was with my mom is we became a lot closer. She's 82 and she doesn't have a lot of social activities. And so we would text every day, which we never communicated when I
Wow.
was at home every day. It was just cool to see like which relationships grew and which people were interested in what I was doing and really wanted to engage. And so
Mhm.
those are the people that I kept in, that I would keep in touch with. And I'm so appreciative. Even Hildy, who you ended up doing
Love
a climb
Hildy.
with, is
Hi,
like,
Hildy.
a woman for our listeners that lives in Norway that I was on Manaslu with on my first expedition. And I just stayed in touch with her. And she just always knew the right things to say to me in the mountains and was a source of inspiration. So I hear what you're saying. And I think for me, the connectivity was really helpful, but it was curated, right? It was something
Right.
that evolved over time. But if it was just one expedition, right? If I was just going to Denali, like I think there is a lot to be gained from not being connected, right? From just
Oh, yeah.
immersing yourself in the experience and not needing to check in with people. But when you're doing something for like almost 10 years, that's for me,
What
it
are you,
wasn't realistic.
what is the maximum number of months you spent climbing in a given 12-month period?
Like 6 months.
Yeah. So you're
So
right.
it's a
Just
lot.
spending 6 months on a mountain being totally disconnected, I think, is not smart because you're going to lose a whole level of support that you really need.
Exactly.
Really good point. Have you continued to stay close with your mom?
I have.
Cool.
Yeah. Like we now, I mean, it's not every day, but we email a lot more and I've been trying to visit her more. And it's been cool that it brought us together.
It's also interesting, like you said, to see. I think this happens more when there's some sort of unexpected tragedy or illness, but you figure out what relationships are most important to you. And those relationships evolve in supportive ways or they don't. That type of learning, I think, is also important and sort of unexpected. I imagine you like didn't think you would end up being closer to some of your family as a result of climbing all these mountains.
Totally unexpected. The thing I liked about the satellite texting is that you can just turn it off, right? So, I mean, I would never leave my friends hanging. I would say, like,
Right.
hey, things are fine, but we're going to be climbing for a few days. I'm not going to check in. But
Yeah.
sometimes I needed to just, not, I don't know. Sometimes people didn't feel supportive at home and I needed to take a break from that. And then I would just sort of draw a boundary and say, oh, I don't have time to do it. And with the time change, you can do that pretty easily.
Just makes me think like we could turn our phones off too. This is really interesting because I would do the same thing on a mountain. I would be like, I can't have this person in my bubble right now. I need to but in my real life, I would never do that. I would like still respond or like, oh, this is so interesting how it enforces boundaries that we don't feel as comfortable with in real life. Maybe that's a survival mechanism. That's really
Yeah,
curious to
it's
me.
interesting, right? I know. I wish I could do that. It's a good point because same thing here. Sometimes something's not productive, but then I think, it's different there because you kind of have an excuse with the time change and
Right.
all the things that are going on. But here it's, I'm just choosing to not communicate with you right now.
Yeah. I might have to enforce mountain boundaries in real life. That might
I,
be a new thing. Yeah.
I like it. I love it.
Well, let's talk about fear a little bit. I imagine there are plenty of times when you felt afraid. Is there one that really stands out to you?
I mean, there was a lot of times that I felt really afraid. So I'm afraid of heights. Like I always,
So just pause there for a second. Tracee Metcalfe, who just summited, became the first American woman to summit all 14 8,000 meter peaks, is afraid of heights.
I am. I've done a lot of work around that. And I know some people don't believe me, but all they need to do is like ride a chairlift, like a ski chairlift with me on a windy day and like watch my like death grip and anxiety. And they'll believe that or watch how cautiously I drive like on a mountain road that has a drop off. So I think your question was like, so one of the experiences where I was really afraid was honestly Everest was my first
Mhm.
successful summit. I was totally unprepared for what the summit ridge, and you've been up there, is
And you
like.
summited the day before me, right? I remember being at
I
Camp
summited the 13th. You remember what day you summited? I think I was a few days before you.
how did I forget this? The 16th?
I think the 16th, because I think you guys were a couple days behind
Yeah. I
with
remember like
because of.
listening to radio transmissions about how windy it was the day you were summiting.
Yes. It was really windy, but that was not what was scaring me. What was scaring me was just that drop off on that final ridge, like after the South Summit, when you're going towards the true summit, and it's thousands of feet down to Everest Base Camp on the left and thousands of
Mhm.
feet down to Tibet on the right. I don't know. It was like somehow I didn't know that it was going to be like that. Like, I mean, I had, watched videos of Everest, read books about Everest. I feel like
Right.
I was surprised by how exposed that was. And of course,
Mhm.
like, you are connected to a fixed rope, but I mean, it's in soft snow anchors. So, right. So that was one of the initially scariest. So after that, I was prompted to evaluate, like, try to find ways to deal with my fear of heights better. Like, I managed that, but it was just like keep going one step in front of the other. And there was some other issues on Everest that contributed to me having a hard time coming down. But after that, I went and started doing EMDR work, which I really thought was helpful, where I would work with a therapist and we would like visualize going through, things that would cause me anxiety with heights. Like, I would like see myself on that ridge, or like if I was getting ready to do Makalu, because Makalu was one of the ones I did after Everest. I would, take photos, like try to prepare myself. And then I would do this visualization with her where she did it, where I was holding, like, there was like a different vibrating thing in each hand that stimulate each side of your brain. It's like normally with eyes. And basically it's, yeah, a technique used for trauma where people think about traumatic experiences and it stimulates each side of their brain. And by like going through it, the thing becomes less traumatic. Really good success with trauma, but it also is promising with fear. So I did that. And then the therapist I worked with was amazing. She would have me, like, part of that is you try to like think about how scary something is. And if it's too much, then you have this technique where you sort of put the fear into a box. So like a figurative box. So I, had like a little like yellow box in my brain. Like, I would acknowledge the fear and be like, I hear you. I understand like why you're afraid of heights. Like, this is dangerous, but right now it's not helpful. So I'm going to put this part of you in this box and ask you to be quiet until we get through this experience. And then you can come out. And like, as corny as that sounds, like, that really helped me a ton.
I think that's a very practical tool for a lot of people to use. And what I've studied is consistent with that you have to recognize the fear. You can't just ignore it or pretend it's
Yes.
not there, because it's a natural part of being human. It's our brains trying to keep us safe. But there's times, especially when you're climbing, that the fear can be detrimental. And you have to just, I think putting it in a box is a great tool to manage it in those situations. And the whole notion of fear in the mountains, I think, is really complex because we need it, right? Like, we need it to stay safe, but
Right.
too much of it, to your point, like the fear you felt walking across that ridge going to the summit of Everest was probably irrational, because the chances of you falling were pretty low. The
Yeah.
consequences could be big, but the chances of you falling when you're on a fixed rope and, you probably had good visibility, pretty low. But our minds just overwhelm us with fear, and that can actually be too much of that can be a bad thing.
And I think what you said, like, right, the acknowledging it part is so important. Because in the beginning, I think when I didn't have any tools, like, I would just like say negative things to myself, like, stop it, that's ridiculous, like, this isn't dangerous, like, instead of acknowledging that my brain was like trying to protect me and keep me safe. And so I
Yeah.
think that, kindness and acknowledgement is huge.
Did you do any other, so aside from EMDR, did you do any other like psychological preparation or mindset or anything else to help you prepare mentally?
I mean, I did. Like you, before I climb a mountain, I spend a lot of time researching it, putting pictures of it around my house, trying to visualize climbing it and knowing like the tricky parts. So I always do that. I think another thing that has worked for me is saying mantras. So just if I
Yeah.
get right into a scary spot, like sometimes I'll just be repeating a mantra in my head and trying to like calm my brain down and just focus focus on saying the words and like being in the moment. I've tried a lot, and sometimes this one works and sometimes it doesn't, where, people try to, you say like, okay, like, let me look at one thing, like, oh, look at that rock. Like, it's really like rough and I feel the texture of it and I smell something and I hear something. So just try to engage your other senses.
Mm-hmm.
I find that for me, that didn't work as great as like sometimes just saying a mantra or
Yep.
something like that.
Mantras are my go-to thing as well. I think in part because they're so easy to implement, right? And once you've used them for a while, you kind of have your list of them and you just grab the one that feels most relevant to that moment. It just, for me, is a big reset. It sort of can be a distraction too. And I don't feel like it's ever been a detrimental distraction. I feel like it's the right kind of distraction that keeps me focused on the right things, but I can let go of the other things that might be not helpful to what I'm trying to accomplish in that moment.
Totally. I started meditating probably like halfway into this project, and it wasn't because I wanted to improve my skills as a climber. I just found meditation, and I think that that's helpful, right? I try to meditate almost every day on the mountain. I don't necessarily always do that as
No,
much
me
as I
neither.
can. I try to, but I think that really helped as well.
I tell myself that just the act of climbing is a meditation, so I give myself a break from like sitting down to meditate on those days.
Right? I like that too. I know I started doing, right? You've done more work with meditation than me, but like walking meditations. And like for me, I kind of allowed myself when I was trekking into the Gasherbrum base camps this summer, like I would get in this state where I would just really try to like just listen to the river and just like focus as I was walking on like the sounds of the river. And like, so I don't know if that's really what walking meditation is
Yeah.
because I haven't been trained in it, but it felt I was getting the same benefits as I would from
Yeah.
just sitting.
Absolutely. When I've tried to do it, I would say unsuccessfully, we had to walk so slowly. So I was like, I would be at a retreat and like part of the schedule would be walking meditation. And you had to just walk so slow so you could be connect and do exactly what you're doing, listening to all the sounds and feel the grass and whatever. And I just like, I do things quickly in general. And because this isn't a good thing, but when I'm outside, I'm usually like training for something, right? So I'm trying to move quickly and efficiently. And so the idea of like, and this is exactly why I should be doing it, but the idea of slowing down is just the opposite of what my brain and body.
Totally. I'm the same as you. It was fun to like just kind of take the parts of it that I thought were helpful, like, because I had to walk at
Yeah.
a certain pace with the group. But then, like I said, just try to quiet my mind and just listen to the river or listen to
Yeah.
the wind.
Well, let's talk about physical training a little bit. Like, even me as a coach, the idea of being healthy and physically fit enough to climb 8,000 meter peaks in a year is insane. So, and you live in Vail, so you have access to hills and you live at elevation too. What was your training protocol like? What did you focus on? What worked and what didn't work for you?
I did a lot, just had a partial knee replacement, and I've struggled with arthritis in my knees for years. So for my training, as much as I can, I would ski uphill with a pack and then ski back down, because skiing down for me was easier on my knees than hiking down. So I did a lot of ski training, but that was based on my physical kind of limitations with my knee. So I looked back to see what I was doing because I knew we were going to talk about this. In the last 2 years, I mean, I would maintain a base level of fitness where I was probably always working out at least 10 hours a week. But then when I would start ramping up my training, it would be like 15 to 20 hours, sometimes more. I think it was too much, honestly. Like, I think I overtrained. I would do like the components that were really I thought important to me was when I'd ramp up my training that I would once a week always try to have a long day in the mountains, which would be like, maybe climbing like a 5-hour climb. And then by the end, it might be like a 10-hour climb. The way I could keep doing that is that for the most part, I would always try to find friends to like, I would, be planning those adventures a week or two in advance. Like, who has this day off? Like, who can go with me on this day? Because I don't want to be by myself for 10 hours every week. Like, I don't think it would have been sustainable. Some of the workouts were by myself, but the big ones I tried to do with other people, and I tried to make it fun. And then I think, the muscular endurance workout, like once a week leading up to it with, I'm sure your listeners probably know, but like with the heavy pack, and I would try to do every week that I would do by myself. And then I would would just fit other things in where I could. I mean, and to be fair, right, I stopped working full time for the last 2 years. So I had a lot of time to train and I had a lot of time to recover. The reason I say I don't know that I overtrained. I don't think it's necessary to train that much, I guess would be my point. So I think for people who are like working full time, and you would know this as a coach more than me, I just don't think you need to do 20 hours a week, right? Like, I think that you could get by with less training and still be well prepared for the mountains.
I think it's about being smart, just to plug having a coach. I think this is part of what being a coach can help you with. That
Yep.
like you're unique in that you weren't working for part of the time. And so you had the time to work out more. But most people don't have that situation. And so we have to be really careful about the time people do spend working out and make sure you're getting the most out of it. And also not doing it too much. Like you said, you weren't sure if you overtrained or not, because that's just going to set you back. Your body and your mind, just you plateau when you overtrain, and that would be the opposite of what you're trying to accomplish.
Totally. And I think, yeah, working with a coach is really the right way to go, especially if you're working and you need to, like, just like you said, maximize your time. And my friends that worked with coaches got a lot out of it. I intermittently worked with a coach, and, I had found him years ago before I did Everest. And then I'm just a very, what do I want to say, faithful person, right? Like, and I'm a little superstitious. So, like, because that coach had helped me on Everest and I had success, like, when I reached out, I would reach out to him. But I think working with a coach is really important.
No, I'm the same way about whatever formula worked the first time is what I'm going to create the second time, the third time, and the fourth time. I'm totally superstitious about that. The other thing I'm curious about, we've talked a little bit about this, is coming back to the real world. And it's a real thing. Like people who've just been on one expedition and come back to jobs and family commitments and work and, yard work and things like that. It can be a difficult transition, but you've just been over the course of 9 years on more than 14 expeditions. How has it been to get back to real life?
It's been not as hard as I thought it would be, to be honest.
Good.
But I do want to acknowledge what you said, because I think that's so true that after each expedition, there can be just this, doesn't matter if it was successful or if it was a failure. I mean, it's less, I think, if it was successful, but there's just this letdown and this reintegration, right? And the grocery store and the lights and the people, it's very overwhelming and annoying to me after being in nature and not having all that. And what I want to say is that for me, it was really helpful. I don't think this is realistic for everyone, but because I knew I was always going to do another expedition, I would sort of play little tricks with my brain. Okay, well, you're back and you feel kind of sad, it's hard to reintegrate, but then I would focus on the next peak. And so that would help me. And I was really afraid, honestly, for how I would feel when I finished this project. Would I struggle with some depression, identity things? And honestly, I haven't yet, but I've had a lot going on, right? So I've had this partial knee replacement. I had to have a thumb surgery. I took some time off from medicine and I'm restudying for my boards. I feel like I've had a lot going on, but it hasn't been as hard as I thought it would be. I mean, there's definitely been some days where I just feel really blue and a little purposeless, but then it hasn't been as bad as I thought. But I think it's important to acknowledge that happens, because I think it's so real. And then, it's kind of can be a cycle, right? You come home and everyone's so you've been away and you've been doing something that some of your friends might feel is selfish because, it's all about you. And then you come home and you're needing extra attention because you're in this mentally kind of fragile state. And so I just want to, for the climbers listening or people who are doing their first expedition, to for them to know that that's normal when you come home to experience that and just be kind to yourself. And
what I have studied about that effect says that you should set another goal, which
interesting.
Personally conflicting views about that, because I think it could be distracting from the feelings you're meant to feel in order to process what just happened. But personally, I have found, like you said, having another goal helps me kind of move forward and still be motivated and not feel let down by the goal I just achieved. So I think it can be a good thing, but I think you have to be careful that you're still processing what you're supposed to be processing.
That's interesting to hear that there's some recommendations to do it. I found it super helpful, right? When you have another goal, it really helps, but then I worry not processing things enough.
What I should be. How do you think you have changed as a result of this? I mean, it's obviously over 9 years, we've all changed, but are there things that you can look back and say, I am this way now because of this project, or is it just too soon to even?
I mean, I think like there's different aspects to it, right? Like physically, I've become a better climber. So Manaslu, that was the first 8,000-meter peak that I was ever on. Considered one of the easier 8,000-meter peaks. And when I first tried it, I thought part between Camp 1 and Camp 2 was exceptionally challenging. And it's like an ice fall in there, and there's steep parts, and I was terrified. So it was really interesting. I went back and finally got to the summit of Manaslu in 2023. So that was my fourth time on the mountain, which
And
is
that is
really
not
funny
a
too.
fun mountain to go back to. I don't know that I would go.
I mean, it's a funny
Yes.
one. Like, so it was my fourth time on the mountain. I can't say that, I mean, there was circumstances beyond my control that caused me not to be able to have a real attempt at the summit the other time. But it was really interesting to go back and just with like my new skill set, with more experience, like see that same terrain and with different eyes and just be like, yeah, I mean, I can see what I was afraid about, but it's didn't feel at all scary anymore. So, physically, I would say, yeah, I've just become a more competent climber for sure. And then I would say mentally, so
Yeah.
I think a big thing is that I just in life, I want to move in a way where I worry less about what people think about me. And I think that this project has really helped that. Like in the beginning, I was so, needing a guide, and I'm needing a Sherpa to help me, and I'm needing to use oxygen, and like, therefore my climb is not worthy. Like I just had a lot of stories I told myself that were like not helpful and not really true. And so I think that this project has really helped me just have more confidence and just be happy with who I am. Like, so I'm not going to summit K2 without oxygen and Sherpa support. And that's fine. Like, I'm more proud of what I've done and just trying not to care about what people think. It's a work in progress, but I think
Oh,
this
yeah.
project helped a lot.
That's very interesting. And I find that there's a lot of that comparing that goes on in mountaineering, and I'm sure in other sports too. But there is, thought that like, oh, if you need to climb with a Sherpa or with a guide, like that's not alpinism, or that's not, you're not a true mountaineer in that case. And that's a very complex comment. And I think that it's highly personalized. And I think that, and I've mentioned this before, Victor Saunders, who's been a climber forever and ever, told me that as long as you're honest about how you climb and you're doing it in a way that doesn't harm anyone else, who cares? Like, but people get really critical of like, oh, you needed this kind of support. And I find that like, where do you draw the line? Like, are you going to not use crampons because those are supportive too? And you could
Right.
argue that those are for safety. And I could argue that oxygen keeps us safe and moving more quickly. And like, it's just a
Right.
very complicated conversation.
I know it's interesting. And I guess I've never gotten to a level in another sport like similar to where I am in climbing. So I assume that there's things like that with other sports, but it's
Probably.
interesting to me how it's a really small handful of people that have the time and the skill to be climbing in a true alpine style.
Right.
It's a handful of
It
people.
is.
And so, like, why are we, as people who are, athletes that are enjoying the mountains, like holding ourselves to that level? And I don't think it's necessary. And I agree with Victor Saunders. And I think, like, right, I mean, with other sports, like with skiing, right, it's interesting. There's beginners, there's intermediates, there's people of all different walks. And, like, I don't know. It's interesting to me how there's a little too much negativity with the elite people in climbing, sort of pointing out the shortcomings of how other people are climbing. And I just think like with skiing, right? Like I'm a pretty accomplished skier, and I just wouldn't feel the need to like
Right.
point out other people's shortcomings. So I'm trying to
And
care
you,
less
you've
about
skied
that.
with me, and I'm a very unaccomplished skier. You didn't point out any shortcomings.
I mean, it's about the love of sport, right? Like getting people into the mountains and doing things they love is just positive. So
But it is interesting that there's that vibe amongst climbers that, like, if you're not doing it a certain way, it doesn't count. And I've
right.
heard other people say that, and I've heard other people compare to other sports where that doesn't exist. And people who are at the high level are super stoked to help beginners and super stoked to help intermediate people. And they're not critical of, oh, like, you aren't worthy of my help or input because you're never going to climb the way I climb.
Right. It's interesting.
So you completed this huge goal, become the first American woman to accomplish something. How do you hope that, and sort of along the same lines of this community of mountaineering, how do you hope that inspires or is viewed by other people, I would say especially women who aspire to climb or aspire to do something audacious in their sport or their realm?
I hope that my story is inspiring. Like, I hope that, like, the fact that, I wasn't an elite climber, an average person that had a job and, like, just fell in love with the sport and just kept trying to progress. I hope that inspires other people to know that, like, none of us are born, like, experts at whatever sport. You've got to start somewhere. And with hard work,
Mm-hmm.
I think we can achieve so many things with hard work. I guess, like, I don't know if you had a question in there about like legacy, and I've been thinking about that. And I was
Yeah.
like, really have like, or how I'd want to be remembered. And I guess like, there's a lot more giving back that I want to do. I've been really focused on my project and haven't had a lot of time, like fundraisers here and there for causes that are important to me. But I hope that like I'm remembered for being humble and kind as I climbed, like, because I think that like, to me, that's really important. And I don't think there's a place in the mountains for not being kind or not being humble. And so I hope that I have carried that through with all of my interactions with people on these expeditions. And then like thinking about like legacy, that's a word that's like, oh, I don't have a legacy, but I do want to.
But you do. Like you've just done something that will be recorded forever.
I mean, I really do want to do more giving back, like working on getting women into climbing. Like I've worked with Ascend Athletics in Pakistan, which is teaching Pakistani women climbing skills. Now that I've done with my project, I want to do more things where I'm working on getting younger women that typically might not have the opportunity to get involved with climbing, get involved. So that's what I want to focus on in the next chapter of my life.
Well, you are kind and humble, and I have no doubt that you will be remembered that way as a human and a climber. What do you wish you had known when you started that you didn't figure out until later on in this project?
So one thing that I didn't know that I think is a big thing is how to keep your water warm.
I love it. Let's talk about it.
Yeah. So in the beginning, like I would put my Nalgene bottles like in the pockets of my down suit. And like if it's not a super cold day, like that kind of works. But if it's a really cold day, like that doesn't work at all. So I think kind of halfway through, I learned that some people were climbing with like a running vest under their down suit with flexible, soft water bottles with straws.
Yep.
And that was a game changer for me. Like, honestly, that is probably the biggest thing that just improved how I felt on summits, because I wasn't staying hydrated in the beginning because my stuff was freezing, or like it was in a pocket and maybe it wasn't frozen, but then the zipper on the pocket froze and I couldn't get the pocket open.
Happened to me.
Or like worse, it's in the backpack. And if your water's in your backpack, you're never going to stop and drink it because there's just not.
And you're just carrying around bricks. Like it's useless to you.
You're carrying around frozen water. So as silly as that sounds, like, and now like I have a new down suit that North Face made, which has actually like a running vest kind of built into it where you can put the soft water bottles. But I think that's huge. And then I would say practice with them, right? Because they're a little risky, right? Like funny story, like they can leak, right? They shouldn't leak if they're screwed on properly. But if you're not careful because you're hypoxic and you're tired and you've got your like sugar solution in there and it's all like not screwed on tight, it's going to leak. If you put it on like your vest before you put your crampons and boots on and you lean forward, like then it's going to come squirting out the top. So you need to practice with them at home. And then, so here was my worst story of the water bottles was on Manaslu last year. I had the new down suit. So I wasn't like as familiar with like how to like secure them in the down suit. And I was going to the bathroom. There was a big poop hole that we were using. And one of my water bottles popped out and like went in next to, not covered in poop. And at that point, this was like on camp 3 to camp 4. And I didn't have another system. So I like had to pick that water bottle up and like rub it in the snow and then like, used hand sanitizer. And like, luckily, like the mouth part didn't go in, but I just practice with it because you tell people that story, they're like, that's why you shouldn't use those water bottles. No, that's not true. Like, I think those water bottles are really helpful, but you just have to
think they are
practice.
too. Yeah, I think they are too. That's a funny story.
Little things like, and I'm sure you go over this with the people who are having you as a coach, right? Like, about having your food accessible, like having practice with your food, having a variety. Just because something works for you at sea level, like that taste of food, like I used to really like scratch lab chews and I still like them, but altitude, for some reason, they just taste different to me. They taste like acid or something. I can't like put them in my mouth. So bringing a variety of things, I think you're the one that like gave me the idea of like popping espresso beans, like just little things that you can like, if you're stuck in a traffic jam, like instead of being like frustrated that you're stuck in the traffic jam, like be like, oh, this is my opportunity to hydrate and eat, and start like your water bottle's right there. All you got to do is put your head down and start popping like some food and nutrition. So I think those are kind of my practical tips.
Those are super important tips. I like the water bottle one as well. I haven't climbed to 8,000 meters since that's been a thing, but that's one thing I suggest to athletes is that they get a vest and they start using those soft flasks. Do you find you have to fill them though? Like I've had some people say, oh, they burn through all the water and like then I got to refill it while I'm on the mountain.
Yes. So I down low, because I use them like right out of base camp. Like I use them for every rotation just so I'm totally familiar with them. And I would say like going from like base camps to like camp 1, camp 2, like each one I have is 500 mils. So I'm definitely drinking more than a liter of water and I'm refilling them, but it's not a big deal down lower because you're usually stopping to take a break. On the summit day, I usually have another 500 mils in a thermos in my backpack. So I have a little extra, but in my experience, if you're drinking a liter of water on a summit day, that's more than a lot of people are drinking. You're doing pretty well. So I would argue like on the summit day, a liter is enough. It's not enough, but it's more than anyone else is getting, right? Like that's the reality of it, is that you just aren't going to drink more than that. So I don't worry about that.
So any other tips for people who are maybe getting ready for, there's a lot of people listening that are probably getting ready to go to Everest for the first time in a couple months. Yeah. Any other tips or things you learned along the way that you want to share?
I think one thing that I didn't appreciate enough was how it's really a multi-day effort, right? Like how you need to be like prepared to climb at least 5 days back to back without proper rest. And so people who are working with you as a coach, I know they're getting that education, but people who maybe aren't working with a coach, it took me a while to realize. So, you know, when you go from base camp to camp 1, you know, you get a rest. Like it's nice. You get to get some sleep. You go up to camp 2, you're probably going to get a rest. After that, like you're really not resting. So when you get to camp 3, you know, you're at almost 23,000 feet. You're in a small tent. Like your sleep is horrible and you're barely eating and drinking. And then 4, the same, and then coming down. And so I think when you're doing your training, thinking about that and pushing yourself some days to not get rest in between your training sessions. And just for me, I mean, you would know more than me as a coach. I'm not saying to overtrain, but it gives you the confidence if you do that at home to know then that when you, because for me, here's an example, right? Like I would normally plan on hoping to get some sleep at camp 4 on different expeditions. And then when it didn't happen for whatever reason, like, oh no, now we're going to like get there at 3 p.m. and we're going to start at 6. Then mentally in my mind, I would start getting upset. Like, oh, but I need to try to sleep. Like, what am I going to do? And like, no, you know what? My body it could do it. But I think just being prepared for that so that you're not like upset if it happens, like count on like, you're probably not going to get sleep the night before your summit. And if you do get some, then that is a bonus. That would be one thing.
Like you said, being flexible. Like when I summited Everest, it was sort of like that. We got to camp 4 late. This ended up not being what we did, but the original plan was that we were going to start climbing at like 9 p.m. And I was like, oh my God, like how I need to like rest and eat and hydrate and lay down for a little bit. And I was really panicking about about things not going the way I thought they were going to go, about my plan being changed. I think testing it, you're right. If you can simulate that at home in some way, you're going to have the confidence in your body and your mind that you can get through. You can't perfectly simulate it because of the altitude, but to the extent you can, it's going to build confidence.
Totally.
Well, thank you so much. This has been a really fun conversation for me, and I know people are going to get a lot out of it. We will link your website as well as some articles about your project in the show notes so people can find you there and learn a little bit more. Anything else before we sign off for today?
No, it's been really fun talking to you as well, and good luck on your upcoming trip.
Thank you.
Hopefully
my water bottle doesn't fall in the poop hole. That's my goal.
Not in the poop hole.
My goal.